Hi, BookTube. Welcome to the first of 3 vlogs where I'm going to be talking about this book, 1812, Napoleon's Fatal March on Moscow by Adam Zamoyski, published by HarperCollins in 2004. I have designed a new template for scripting these multi-part vlogs that I use for longer nonfiction. So this is me doing a bit of a test drive. So with this new format, I do want to talk a little bit about the author. Adam Zamoyski was born in 1949, on the same day in January that I was, as it happens. His parents fled Poland in 1939 when Hitler's armies invaded, and they chose not to return after the war. They stayed in Britain. Adam attended Downside School in Bath. He studied history and modern languages at Oxford. He speaks 5 languages: Polish, English, French, Italian, and Russian. And he's written 12 books in total, including a biography of Napoleon, books about Polish history, and about notable Poles such as Chopin. Then I want to talk about why am I choosing to read this book. All the books about Russia that you've seen me read since I started the channel, they are preparation for rereading Tolstoy's War and Peace. I say rereading. I read War and Peace when I was 14 years old. I read it on a dare. My English teacher, who was probably just joking, told the whole class that he dared us to read Tolstoy's big book. And I wanted attention and affirmation and applause, all those words beginning with A. But I had no idea what I was reading. I had no idea about the history. I did find the characters interesting. And those were the days when there wasn't a lot of homework assigned. I didn't have a job. I wasn't dating anyone. I didn't have a lot of responsibilities at home. In short, in a situation like that, you may as well read Tolstoy's War and Peace. But this time, I want to come to Tolstoy with better background knowledge. For this first vlog, I am just going to summarize the introduction and the first 9 chapters. I will come back to other aspects of the book in later vlogs. The introduction. Zamoyski explains why he thinks this is the best time to write a history of Napoleon's invasion. And that's because in the 19th century and also the early 20th century aftermath of Napoleon, because he had that kind of aftermath, there was so much at stake for the political reputations of France and Russia. And that in turn meant that many primary sources were not made available to historians, or it was clear that the historians who had researched were writing with a priority on their nation's honor. And so truth had to take second place. Chapter 1 opens with an interesting quote that Napoleon apparently said to one of his chamberlains. He said, "To leave my throne to my heirs, I will have had to be master of all the capitals of Europe." Now we know he did not get to be master of all, but it was interesting to learn, for me, how much power Napoleon did amass at the height when his infant son had been accepted as the next Holy Roman Emperor. France, under Napoleon, was a country whose boundaries stretched as far as Barcelona and Rome and Hamburg. There were territories beyond that which were French dependencies, and beyond that there were countries like Denmark and Norway which were independent, but they were allied. Russia had also been an ally, but the strength of that alliance was faltering. Napoleon could foresee a problem if Russia chose to switch sides and join forces with his only other enemy, Great Britain, against him. That, he felt, would destabilize the German states, which says something about how stable they were, and also possibly Poland, and it would mean that all that France had gained in Eastern Europe would probably be lost. And this is what the map is for. This is from Zamoyski's book, and you can see the 3 different territory types. In the darkest solid gray is France as it was in 1811. So you can see how far its boundaries stretch. And then the territories which are gray striped, but the stripes are closer together, such as Spain, and you can see a lot of area in what is now Italy, Germany, Poland. Those would be dependencies, territory that belonged to Napoleon, although it was not considered part of France. And then in the gray stripes, where the stripes are a little further apart, Norway and Denmark, you can see those are the allies. Now, chapter 2 made me very glad that I'd read a biography of Catherine the Great. Zamoyski introduces his readers to Tsar Alexander, Catherine's grandson. He can't give a lengthy biography, but thanks to me reading Virginia Rounding's work, I knew the peculiar dynamics of the Russian royal family. And so I could understand why Alexander, so eager to be different than his father and his grandmother, so burdened with the idea of responsibility, was easily manipulated by Napoleon, initially. But Catherine always said that her first grandson was a very intelligent boy, so it made sense that Alexander was quick to learn from his mistakes and come up with his own Machiavellian plan to undermine Napoleon. And this early 19th century cartoon is depicting, satirically, the meeting between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander at Tilsit. This was the meeting at which Alexander was deceived and manipulated. And the figure you can see swimming behind the raft that it's standing on is the unfortunate Prussian king, Frederick William, who was a relative of Tsar Alexander's, and whom Napoleon not only defeated but humiliated in defeat. And that should have been a warning to the young Tsar. Chapter 3 was an eye-opener because it examined how Napoleon's rule over Europe dismantled the authorities and boundaries of hundreds of small states in the center of Europe. I'm quoting now from page 41. Every time a French army passed through one of these areas, it disturbed a venerable clutter of archaic law and regulation, of privilege and prerogative, of rights and duties, releasing or awakening a variety of pent-up or dormant aspirations in the process. Every time France annexed a territory, she reorganized it along the lines of French Enlightenment thought. Rulers were dethroned, ecclesiastical institutions were abrogated, ghettos were opened, guild rights, caste privileges, and other restrictions were abolished, and serfs and slaves were freed. Nowhere more so than in Germany. From that quote above, you might draw the conclusion that the newly conquered citizens loved their new emperor. The reality was more complicated. I appreciate how Zamoyski spent time in this chapter shifting back and forth between the benefits of French rule to its European subjects and the abuses. I imagine that for many it was very difficult to decide for or against Napoleon when he marched on Russia in 1812. Now we've arrived at chapter 4. We have been grounded in the circumstances which led to Napoleon's acquisition of power and how he was holding on to it. We have been grounded in the circumstances which created the alliance between Tsar Alexander and Napoleon. Chapter 4 then talks about the shuttle diplomacy that happened as we got closer to 1812. You're moving back and forth between Paris and Moscow. You're getting quotes from royal and diplomatic letters and diaries, and it starts to expose the falseness and starts to pinpoint also the decisions being taken by each monarch, which led them finally to make preparations for war. And that leads nicely into chapter 5, which is purely about Napoleon's preparation. Napoleon's army, the transnational army that Napoleon assembled for his war against Russia, was the largest force ever organized in the history of war up to that point. If you love the logistics of war making, how armies are assembled and trained and supplied and positioned, and how plans are drawn up for their deployment and how good those plans were, this chapter is going to fascinate. But what I found interesting was something that is so obvious, and yet I've never thought of it before until it was stated here. Quoting from page 97. And horses needed to be fed. This detail was to be the crucial element in the forthcoming campaign. It even decided the timing of its start, as there could be no question of hauling fodder for the horses as well as supplies for the men. The horses would have to be fed on the new harvest of hay and oats. Cavalrymen were issued with sickles for this purpose, and none of these crops would be ripe for harvesting before the end of June at the earliest. This meant that while he had to be moving his troops in the inclement marching conditions of the winter and early spring, Napoleon could not open his campaign until the middle of summer, which left him with very little time in which to achieve his victory. Everyone talks about the Russian winter defeating Napoleon, and it's not that that's not true, but this factor is so crucial. This was the first time I understood why he left it so late to attack in the first place. There's also a discussion about the French foot soldiers' uniform and kit, how impractical these items were, particularly the stockings and the knee-length gaiters, which fastened very tightly just at the join of the knee. They restricted movement, and also the shoes, the boots that the men were issued with, were not robust enough for long marches, but more of that later. Chapter 6. Catalogues the diplomatic and the economic blunders that Napoleon made, which just added to the problems of all his plans to attack Russia. In terms of diplomacy, Napoleon dealt with his conquered territories, his unconquered allies, and his unconquered enemies, for that matter, as if they were just lower ranks of foot soldiers. You could just impose your will on them. You could expect instant and unquestioning obedience. In the German and Polish territories, he deposed existing rulers and he appointed his relatives and friends in their place, and many of those had never been rulers before. He sent envoys to make enticing promises to various nationalist groups who had reason to fear Russia. The problem was Napoleon would take those promises back when he was face to face with the representatives of those groups, so he built up bad faith. And this chapter quotes a number of diaries and letters written by Napoleon's associates with suggestions that the French emperor actually did doubt his chances of success before his army ever got close to the Russian border. But with an enormous military machine already in motion, however badly prepared it might be, it was too late to pull back without a huge loss of faith. And Napoleon, like all very powerful people, could not deal with any loss of status. I put this map up here because it illustrates how Napoleon chose to make war against Britain. He could not do so militarily because that would mean a fight at sea, which he knew he could not win. So what he did instead was impose a trade blockade all around continental Europe. So no British ships could dock at European ports that belonged to France. What Napoleon didn't really count into those calculations was that blockade effectively impoverished some of the dependent territories, who up until that point had a flourishing trade with Britain. And although there was a great deal of smuggling during this period, it did not make up for those losses. Chapter 7 is the straw that breaks the camel's back chapter. Napoleon makes an attempt. There actually needs to be a word to describe an attempt to do something that is so badly thought out that it might have been better to do nothing. Anyway, he made an attempt to reopen negotiations with Tsar Alexander, but it was the stupidest possible time. He already had his army marching towards Russia, and the Tsar can't afford to lose face any more than Napoleon. Alexander had amassed his troops close to the Russian border, awaiting a certain French invasion. He refused to meet Napoleon. Of course he did. The rest of the chapter is about the hardships encountered by the army as they marched through East Prussia and Poland. These territories were not as intensely cultivated or as fertile at the time, and this reality can partly be blamed on Napoleon himself, because he cut off the export market for agricultural products with his trade blockade against Great Britain. The army literally starves as it marches east. There are desertions and suicides in disturbing numbers. Horses died from exhaustion and colic because they were fed unripe grain. I was absolutely astounded by the numbers that were quoted. I had assumed that any horrific losses were all sustained in battle, not before it. In Chapter 8, Zamoyski balances things. He lets us know that the Russian army, though it was better supplied and it was more familiar with the territory that it was making war in, they weren't better prepared for Napoleon's first strike. They retreated because they had no other viable option. And the chapter examines Tsar Alexander's leadership style, which was indecisive. He was terrified of making the wrong decision, and that made his behavior contradictory. At times he would trust his generals to know what they were doing. At other times he would interfere, and he could be easily manipulated by his generals, and they didn't get along with each other. So they moved him to take sides and switch sides in any discussion about strategy. And the absence of fast communication, of course, meant that there was a disunited defense of Russia. Speaking of communications, that leads nicely into Chapter 9. In contrast with Tsar Alexander and all his meddling, the problem with Napoleon's leadership during the war was his distance from the front lines. Lines of communication, they were slow. They were often broken completely because, if you can imagine, a messenger had to travel either on foot or on horseback, if he could get a horse, over territory that was unmapped, and it was usually full of hostile peasants because their land and their houses had been plundered by the advancing French troops. Napoleon's generals, of course, they were just as disunited as Alexander's, but whereas Alexander could and did because he was close and he could meddle, he could find out the truth in some cases, Napoleon was repeatedly and deliberately misinformed by his generals about the state of the troops, horses, and equipment. And in spite of all this, Napoleon's army advanced so quickly that the Russians really had no option but retreat. In their favor, you can say they were very good at retreating. They could pack up their supplies so efficiently and effectively that the French who might come and take over their campsites couldn't scrounge any food, couldn't find any equipment left over, boots, for example, because for most of them their footwear had worn thin. There were French soldiers marching barefoot in numbers across Russia, if you can believe it. And so the retreat eventually became deadly for the French. It opened up a greater distance between the troops and their leader, between the troops and any reliable source of supplies. Some estimates say that Napoleon had lost a third of his fighting force before they ever engaged the Russians in combat. And that, dear BookTube, is the end of part 1 of this vlog. Really eye-opening for me. I think it was really good to get up close to Napoleon at his highest point of influence. It does give you a sense of what his capabilities were. I do feel that he had once been a general who could inspire his troops and could make good tactical decisions at one time, and also that he had a talent for administration. He did dismantle some old political and economic structures in Europe, and that set up the right conditions for German unification and industrialization. He was less capable when his empire and his armies grew larger. The territory that he had to administer or make war over grew larger. And he relied on prejudices rather than actual knowledge about the world beyond France, his allies, and defeated territories. And with no effective opposition to his power, there was nothing to counter any disastrous decisions that he began to make. I imagine my next blog will be in August, about 1812. What are you going to get in the meantime? I've recently finished a short work of nonfiction by the British comedian David Baddiel, and it takes, I believe, a more balanced, more understanding, more compassionate look at atheism versus belief, and it's entitled The God Desire. Look out for that very soon. In the meantime, I hope everybody's reading is on track for July. The sun has come for a little visit to the UK. It's not trying to kill us the way it seems to be doing in other parts of the world. So tomorrow I'm going to take my latest book outside. I need to top up my vitamin D. Take care, everybody. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.